Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have the one and only Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas is a cultural critic, he's a writer and an author. He's the contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, columnist at HalfBreeds, and his work has been featured in The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, among many other places. He has written 2 memoirs, Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White, of which we discuss in the conversation. We talk about some of the reasons that he wrote these memoirs and the main themes of race. We talk about the history of the one-drop rule for Black Americans. We talk about this notion of leaving race behind and how that's distinctly different from culture. We talk about his perspective living abroad. Thomas has lived in Paris for about 10 years, and so he has a unique perspective in looking at American politics and culture. We talk about the role of biracial or multi-ethnic perspectives as being different from other folks and what that offers. And we talk about some of the main themes with council culture today and getting a better compass for dealing with racism and discrimination. I've been wanting to talk to Thomas for a long time, and I was really happy I finally got to talk to him. We had a great conversation, and I got to be able to ask him all these questions I had been thinking about for some time, and really flush out some of these different perspectives on race and culture and how we can have a more nuanced approach in tackling these hard conversations. So I hope everyone enjoys this conversation as much as I did. And now I bring you Thomas Chatterton Williams. I am here with the one and only Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been really looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So lots to get into. I will have introduced you in the intro and everything. Let's just kind of first start talk about your memoir that you wrote. I guess your second one, if you will, the Self-Portrait in Black and White. What kind of inspired you to write this and write a memoir? And usually memoirs are usually about a piece of someone's life, right? Or a certain snapshot. And so what kind of inspired you to write it, and what are your big things you're trying to share with us in it?
Sure. Well, I didn't intend to do this, but I ended up writing 2 memoirs before the age of 40. And I think they kind of make sense together. And Self-Portrait is the second of the 2. The first, Losing My Cool, which I published 10 years earlier, or 9 years earlier. It's a coming of age story. It's a story of a mixed race Black boy, really performing a kind of Black masculinity that I conflated with racial authenticity, and buying into this very American notion that race is pretty real, and that it's binary, and that you're either or. And therefore, these categories are such that they can't be transcended. And, I was born in 1981, and my father was born in 1937 in the segregated South. It wasn't really so complicated growing up in New Jersey for me, defining myself as Black and being defined as Black and accepting that these were the laws of nature, more or less. It wasn't even until I was 19 years old, in the year 2000, that you were even able to check more than one box on the United States Census. And that kind of, all of a sudden, that exploded the mixed race category of the population. But I was already, an adult, and I never perceived myself as being mixed race. So it wasn't really like, something that gave me much stress. But about the age of 29, 30, I was engaged to a French white woman. And it started to occur to me that I could have children that would probably really challenge my faith in the one-drop rule, that would really push that kind of logic to the limit. And this was the kind of impetus for writing the second book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, which was going into the pregnancy of my daughter in 2013, believing that my child would be mixed but would still be fundamentally Black, because Black is an either or proposition. rooted in a drop of black blood, really slavery logic. And the experience of having my daughter and realizing that her identity was going to be a lot more complicated than that, and not feeling that I have a white daughter, but feeling that these categories actually don't capture us. And I don't think that they really capture anybody, that these categories are failing to describe the complexity of the lives that we actually do live.
Hmm. Yeah.
So the book is an argument against race.
Mm-hmm. I think the first part of the book I mentioned, Self-Portrait, is you talk a little bit about this whole one drop rule kind of thing. And I'm going to assume most of the listeners in the United States have heard that or familiar with it, but just give us the 2-minute version of what that is and then how you're pushing against that.
The one drop rule is, something coming from the laws of hypodescent that were legally enforceable in former slave territories. Anything to 1/32 black ancestry made somebody legally black, regardless of appearance, regardless of what their family looked like. So, a drop, any non-white ancestry fundamentally disqualified somebody from the status of whiteness, which was the status of freedom during slavery. So you had, in practice, it gave masters, slave owners, the right to have illegitimate children with their slaves, to have mixed race children who took their racial identity from the enslaved mother, and therefore their status was unfree, and they were not able to inherit property. It really does go back to inheritance of property. But, there's an important side of it, which is what I think I grew up with, which is what Barack Obama and many people have talked so eloquently about, which is that it started that way, but it became a form of solidarity within the black community that really is something lovely, that people look like you, they look like me, they look like all types of different phenotypes, and they can all be under the umbrella of blackness, because black people are this physically very diverse group of people who have some type of experience in common that's rooted in a history of slavery. But we flip that into something accepting and welcoming. And that's the way I did experience black identity. But so what I'm pushing back against is not black identity. I'm pushing back against this whole racial binary that pits blackness against whiteness, and that really doesn't have any roots in biological reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think so. One of the big things that's come out in the memoir, I've read it twice, it's really good, is you start to talk about this concept of, and I've seen you say it in other written pieces and essays as well, it's this idea of leaving race. And I have questions about that, and I'm curious about it, because I'll show my cards at the front. I'm mostly sympathetic to this concept, but I want to hear just you kind of spell it out, and then see where we get with it. But it sounds like the binary is the thing that's most troublesome to you. But where did you come up with this concept of trying to let's just abandon this idea of race and leave it, at least for yourself? And what does that look like for you?
Well, my thinking was impacted by people who have arrived at these conclusions before me. My daughter's birth was the impetus for me reflecting on racial identity in a way that my own upbringing hadn't forced me to. My daughter challenged my belief in the logic of the one-drop rule, and also, I should say, I live in Paris nowadays, and my daughter was born in Paris, and trying to explain slave logic to Europeans who didn't grow up in a society where that was the law of their land. They had colonies and stuff, but they didn't have slavery within their borders, and they don't think in terms of actually the law of hypodescent. Hearing myself explain this stuff to people who didn't accept it as normal was really a trip. It kind of helped me see that, wow, it doesn't just naturally make sense necessarily. So that was the beginning of my questioning of things that I had accepted. But then, I was really profoundly impacted by reading a book called Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life by Barbara and Karen Fields, two sisters, who make the really compelling argument that race functions, or racecraft functions in society. All of the language customs, the habits of speech, the habits of socialization, the ways that we constantly reproduce racial categories in our day-to-day lives. This functions in society the way that witchcraft functioned in Salem, Massachusetts, or still functions in parts of Africa, where there's no such thing as witches, but a society that believes in witchcraft can burn people at the stake for being witches. There's no such thing as distinct human races, but societies that participate in racecraft create categories along a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy. And that really made sense to me. And then in 2017, I was profiling an artist and philosopher named Adrian Piper, who's American but lives in Berlin now. And she really had a kind of provocative artistic gesture in 2012 where she publicly retired from being Black. She's a woman that can pass for many things. People don't necessarily always look at her and know that she's Black, but both of her parents were Black. And what she was saying wasn't that she hates her culture or anything like that, but she said that she was stepping out of that race game, and she was retiring from the labor of working at being in a society that makes you fall into a category. And thinking about her gesture and her arguments and the arguments of racecraft and my own personal experiences with my daughter, it sent me down this path of saying that race isn't real. Several hundred years ago, in the collision of Africa and Europe through the exploitation of the slave trade and the New World, we made these categories rigid and real. And anything that's made can theoretically be unmade. And, this is not so far out of step with things that James Baldwin wrote. People have been saying this. James Baldwin said that it's impossible, but we owe our children nothing less than the impossible. We have to imagine, that we can get past our delusions, and skin race is a delusion. We owe it to our children. So, I think it's, in the book, I make the point that this is a kind of naivety. People look at you and say, how are we going to do that? And of course it's a kind of naivety, but that's what I think we actually have to recapture. We're too sophisticated in the ways that we think about human difference.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're making the claim that race is a social construct. It's something we've created as a type of hierarchy to delineate between some versus others.
Absolutely, it's a social construct, and I don't mean to dismiss. Sometimes people say, "Well, does that mean that you're saying that racism isn't real?" And it's like, of course, I'm not saying that. In fact, I would say what the Field sisters argue is that racism creates race, and not the other way around. It's race is a justification for a kind of exploitation, a racist exploitation that preceded it. The social construct is real, but when you basically say that we know that race isn't biologically meaningful, but it's socially meaningful and constructed in a way that we can't escape, then you basically say we were wrong to think of it as biologically real, and we're going to double down and keep thinking about human difference in this wrong way. I think we have to be anti-racist, oppose what clearly is racism, but also keep our eyes on a further higher goal, which is to be anti-race and to imagine the future society, the future multi-ethnic society we want to bring into creation, which would be one that would be beyond the racial categories we take for granted now.
Yeah. What do you say about folks that say, well, we understand certain, some people will say we understand people, maybe you don't want to classify them as race, but as a certain type of based on phenotypic presentation, right? Or certain population groups from certain areas around the globe, where, I know what, someone looks like if they're Asian versus Latin versus, certain parts of Africa. Like, even if you do it by region or by categories, you can say, well, yes, I know that you're not, maybe I can't pinpoint exactly where you're from, but I know you're from this area or this part based on your genetics, based on your phenotypic presentation. Some people would say that is an element of what we would call race, that you would just use a different name for it, or how would you kind of understand that?
Well, that stuff exists and is real. Population groups are real. Heredity is real. You can make reasonable judgments of what part of the world somebody's ancestors came from based on certain features they may have, but that none of that amounts to the level of distinct human races. And in the kind of multi-ethnic societies we live in now, we have brains and stereotyping mechanisms that were evolved for societies of hunter-gatherers that basically interacted with 60 people in their entire world. And anybody who looked different was coming from outside of their world and was potentially a threat. Nowadays, we live in places like Toronto or London, New York, or lots of places, even small towns where you're encountering people that may look like they come from somewhere, but they haven't been in that place for generations. Right. And in fact, you can't look at somebody and know things that tell you anything necessarily meaningful about their ancestry. I mean, it's very difficult to say what genetically is different between a Chinese person and a Japanese person or a Korean person. In fact, I'll take the L if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that there is nothing genetically different between these peoples. Mm-hmm. There are only ethnic differences, mm-hmm. And that there's more human diversity within the continent of Africa than between Africa and any other place. Mm-hmm. So, these are important things to keep in mind at all times. Also, the amount of mixing that has happened in North America, for example, the average Black American whose ancestry traces back to slavery is 80% on average West African descended and at least 20% usually Anglo-Saxon, mm-hmm. European. There are millions of white people, so-called white people, walking around who have enough African DNA in them to have been enslaved under those laws of hypodescent we were talking about. So what do we actually mean? There's no point at which, as the great writer Albert Murray pointed out, there's no one trait or point at which you can put your finger on the thing that differentiates a Black person from a white person or anything in between. There's no one phenotype, there's no one nose, there's no hair texture. These things actually break down whenever you try to pinpoint the thing that makes somebody something. There's no essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I fully agree with what you're saying. My next question here is, okay, so what do we do about culture, right? Because I think sometimes people might confabulate and say, well, Chatterton Williams is saying that, I leave race. And so he's abandoning his at least his Black culture or if anyone else were to do this, right? For myself, I'm half white, half Latin. So, if I were just leaving the whole thing behind and I'm going to, just abandon my Latin culture, I don't think that's what you're saying. Could you, or maybe you are, but could you clarify how you're making the distinction of to leave race does also mean to leave culture, or you're segregating the two to say, no. We can still be proud of our culture, our heritage, our history. The race aspect of it is the piece. And how do you delineate between the two?
Well, yeah, I don't think that there's any necessity in describing ethnicity and culture in racial language. I certainly haven't changed the music that I listen to. I participate in a Black cultural tradition that is meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. I come from a community that I think persevered against incredible odds and made extraordinary contributions to American music, sports, literature, art, human dignity that I think I participate in. But there's nothing about blood and skin in that. That's a group of people in a specific place at a specific time. They were made Black or deemed Black, but they're actually not the same people as newer immigrants who come from Africa or from the Caribbean. It's a different people. And, there is no Black essence that unites everybody. My mother is, derived from certain European ethnicities. They're not interchangeable with other European ethnicities, actually. There is no monolithic whiteness, really. And I think that actually one of the great harms that has happened in society is the notion that there is a monolithic whiteness, and white people have lost some understanding of the specificity of their ethnic and cultural heritage in America. So I think that it's important to maintain cultural traditions, and people feel real allegiance to that. I think that I have a greater tolerance for individualism than many people have, but I just don't think there's anything about blood and skin or race about these things. And I think that it actually harms us when we couch these things that we do want to hold on to in racialized language.
So this might be jumping to the other topic I want to hit at some point. But so, okay. I mean, let's say one were to get on board with that. Like, okay, Thomas, I can get on board with what you're saying. You know, blood and skin, we've been looking at this hierarchy wrong. Okay. So how do we practically do that then? Right? How do people practically leave their race? Because then you would say, well, I mean, there are stories, right? I don't know if it's this widespread kind of notion that some people like to try and make it, but you can say like, well, I mean, obviously racism happens, you know, people get called racial slurs. There's certain types of hate crimes, you know, people are getting, you know, assaulted and killed in different parts of the world based on the color of their skin. I mean, that still happens. How much you can specifically pinpoint that that's what it is, you know, okay, maybe that's a little bit harder to do, but we can agree that racism still exists. So how can we live in a world practically where people are saying, or more people are saying more and more, well, I'm going to leave this notion of this way in which we've socially constructed this and try to just see more of our individuality and to see more of how that looks for each person. You know, how do you have any ideas or notions of how people can practically, you know, kind of do this?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that, I mean, it's not going to be something that an individual can do on their own. Mm-hmm. It requires a critical mass of people deciding that these categories cause more harm than good. I don't think that that's impossible. But, you know, your identity is a constant negotiation between who you present yourself as and what the institutions and people you interact with reflect back at you. Mm-hmm. I can't just go outside and say that I'm Chinese or that I'm a rabbit or whatever, because the rest of the world won't accept that. But, you know, I think that actually a lot of people could say that, you know what, I'm not going to define myself as white. I'm going to say that, like, my family comes from Calabria on my father's side. On my mother's side, they're Ashkenazi Jews from Brooklyn. And that's who I am. And I grew up in the Upper East Side, and I'm from America, and I'm racially human. I mean, these are small things or things that people might roll their eyes at. Enough people do that, and we stop reproducing all of the little linguistic customs of racecraft, then you have the possibility of having political alliances that are based on values and that are based on policies as opposed to identity politics and the politics of racial differentiation. You get to a different way of belonging to and interacting with each other. It takes persuasion. It takes making a compelling case for why we might actually gain more than we lose by putting the sword of identity down. It's certainly not something that I'm so naive as to think will happen overnight.
Sure.
But if you can't envision the society that you hope to get to, you're probably not going to end up there. And I think right now we're on exactly the opposite track. We're incentivized in every way to act as though there are essential differences between people, that white people are inherently racist, that white people are inherently privileged, and that they actually can't understand non-white experiences and perspectives. They can be allies, but we don't participate in the same humanity. This is dangerous. This is a way, I think, of having short-term progress or short-term power gains that will have long-term consequences that further divide us. So, yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and it's a question I can't answer to anyone's perfect satisfaction, but I would say that, you know, without being glib, there is some truth in Chief Justice John Roberts' famous retort that the way that you stop discriminating based on race is to stop discriminating based on race. It takes enough people doing that, you know?
Yeah. So to kind of follow up with that, it's two parts, and then we'll get to some of the current social stuff. Now people can see, you've lived in Paris for a long time now, right? With a decade?
It's gone quickly. I've been here for 10 years.
Yeah. You've lived in Paris for a while. I was there 2 years ago. It's a lovely place. I like Paris a lot. I like France. I like France. My daughter loves it too. So it's a really awesome place. And you know, some people might say like, well, that's easy for him to say, right? He's looking at this, with his, binoculars across the pond and just seeing like what all the Americans are doing over here. And he's removed from this. And, he's, not as tethered to, the, Black Americans anymore. And, he's lived over there in Paris. And, what do you say about claims like that? It's like, you're not, you don't have boots on the ground, right? It's like, okay, well, maybe if he was here, if he was here last summer or, something would have seen it, maybe it would be different. I don't really think so necessarily, but what do you say about people saying like, oh, he's just kind of from, making these claims from afar, and, that's different than people that are among it and, with it, day to day. What do you say about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critique that I've received, pretty, regularly from certain people online, especially. But it's never
I see those critiques. They're harsh sometimes. I don't like seeing that.
It's never one that was particularly persuasive to me, just because, there's a long and really distinguished tradition of Black American writers going to Europe, particularly to Paris, France, and having a kind of clarity of vision, looking back across the ocean at America and seeing some of what's good and a lot of what's bad about the particular way that American society does race. It's not to say that things are perfect over here, but you don't lose your investment in American society or politics, or you don't stop caring about your family and friends who are still over there. And in the age of the internet, you really don't lose touch with what's going on there. Right. But the remove might actually, I want to turn the question back to some of these critics and say that, have you ever considered that the distance might actually allow you to see things in a way that are less biased and actually potentially more helpful, because you're stepping outside of, you're getting a clearer view. Yeah. I mean, I certainly believe James Baldwin achieved that when he left, and it's something that I try to do. I don't necessarily think that if you're fighting for freedom and you're fighting to kind of transcend the racialization of Blackness in America, and you come a step closer to that by leaving the American social context and looking back and seeing what is so suffocating about being in American society. I don't know. I mean, what is the point of the struggle? The point of I've always felt that the point of the struggle is also to achieve some of that freedom to reflect.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of this, you have a view that other people don't. I kind of see it as you have the wide lens view, right? You have the wide shot angle, right? You're and kind of a more, I don't want to say global, but like it's not, I think a lot of the times everyone does this, even online, people are very US centric, right? It's just always about like, what is the things that are happening to the US right now. And we miss a lot of the times there's a big world, there's many countries, many cultures, ethnicities, and where does it sit in context of other places around the world? So I think in one sense, your perspective, I think Baldwin also lived in France, and other folks, Black Americans that have lived abroad, it gives a different, it does give a different perspective. I also think, didn't Frederick Douglass, I think he also traveled abroad as well. And he
traveled to Ireland and the UK and London. Yeah. And it was a very important experience for him. W.E.B. Du Bois studied in Berlin.
Right.
Richard Wright famously said there was more freedom in a square block of Paris than in the entire United States of America. I mean, there's Creole, mixed race Black Americans of some wealth in the 1800s came to France to live in a society where they could live in accordance to their class, as opposed to their racial caste. Right. This is a long, old tradition of people leaving America. And of course, not every Black person can leave America, and nor should they. There's something to be said about staying home, fighting for the society you want to achieve. And I don't even know that I've permanently left America, but I do think that more people might consider leaving and spending time outside of their immediate immediate context. One of the things that really struck me when I first lived in France right after college was the understanding that race is made locally. That my physical characteristics, for example, mean something different in a French context as yours would than they mean in a North American context. Where in North America, somebody might think I'm Latino or a light-skinned Black. In France, they assume that I'm probably North African of Muslim descent. And so it was an eye-opening experience to realize that race, there's not something inherent in your racial identity. It's unstable. These things are incoherent, actually, and they're arbitrarily assigned loosely based on a kind of interplay between a society's expectations of what characteristics mean and what your characteristics signal. And that kind of really was something that, has stayed with me. And I think it's an important thing for people to experience, actually, that different societies do race differently. If you go to Brazil, they actually have the exact opposite of the one drop rule. A drop of white blood makes someone not Black. It doesn't mean that that's right or that America's right. It just means that there are different ways of thinking about human variation and difference. And I think it's healthy to get outside of the complete American-centric view of these things.
Yeah, no, certainly. And Brazil is a fascinating case. I mean, they were one of the last countries to end slavery, I think 1890 or somewhere around there. And they have their own issues with segregation throughout the 20th century. So, I mean, yeah, that's also a very interesting case. The last thing before we move on to the current events is, so you tell me what you think about this, because I thought about this for a while. This stuff comes easy to me in understanding this, right? Meaning not that it's easy to understand, but that it clicks for me. It makes sense. And like I said, I'm multi-ethnic, if you will. You're biracial. I've talked to John Wood. He's also biracial. I've talked to Iona. Many folks that have different ethnicities or different races. This stuff just kind of seems to make sense. And do you think there's something to that, for us half-breeds, right? Are we just, this is just our existence, right? We understand what it's like to basically have a foot in both worlds, right? Culturally and things like that, and I find that when I talk to folks that are, Black Americans or Latino Americans or, white Americans, there's something that doesn't click. Like they get some of it, but they don't get all of it. And I wonder, again, not that it says it makes us special or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but the fact that that's just our existence. We just are always in two kind of, if you will, proverbial, kind of houses, if you will, right? How do you think there's something to that, right? Of when if you and I talk to folks online that are, quote unquote, mostly Black or mostly Latin or mostly white, there's a disconnect. It's like there's a certain point, and then there's like a wall that you hit, and folks just can't seem to quite understand it. But you and I can have this conversation, and I'm like, yeah, of course, yeah, I get it. Like I'm totally with you on this. And when I've talked to other folks in the same way, do you think that obviously it's your perspective, but is there something that perspective is offering, or how do you just see that in terms of folks that are biracial or multi-ethnic by that hierarchy as opposed to folks that aren't?
Well, I mean, it's true. We still live incredibly segregated lives, so many of us, especially in America. And one of the things that you often can have in a family that's of mixed background is a fundamental insight that a lot of people who don't have mixedness in their family, you can have the insight that what it is to love and be loved by multiple races, or what are called races, multiple ethnicities. Let me just say, I knew what it was like to be loved by white people and Black, so-called white people and so-called Black people growing up. It never occurred to me that all white people could be racist, because my mother was there loving me in my house, and I loved her. And it never occurred to me that all Black people could be violent or whatever the stereotype that attaches to Black people, or because my dad was right there and I loved him and I saw his full humanity. So the stereotype didn't apply. And I do think that there's a kind of, there's an aspect to that experience that people, for example, Ta-Nehisi Coates said he had never known white people. He had never known any white people. One of the most listened to voices on race in America until he began working in elite journalistic spaces, never knew white people. That's kind of crazy, but like, it's not that unusual. And many, many white people don't have Black friends still to this day in 2021. But, you know, I am optimistic, not because I'm some kind of Panglossian that thinks that we're just going to beige the world until all our problems go away. But, you know, the mixed race, the so-called mixed race population is exploding. And that's the fastest growing demographic of babies born in America. Clearly, more and more people will have the experience that you have had, that I have had, of knowing people from different perspectives and backgrounds, and also therefore not projecting the worst stereotypes onto entire groups of people because they have had experiences with individuals that would directly counter that. So that makes me optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's true for you and I. That's probably going to be more true for your kids. It's going to be true for my daughter, you know, because they have more you know, directly, you know, all of this mixture that's happening. And so to have this kind of, you know, fetishizing of race all the time is going to just seem odd. And their peers are also going to be more mixed, and it's going to be much different. So there's some hope there. So I guess the one of the last things I'll chat with you about here is, you know, this could, you know, talk about this for hours. So at least in the United States, and I know in other countries as well, but oh my goodness, we're just going in the opposite fucking direction. I mean, it's just complete opposite. We have all of this stuff now where we are obsessing about race and racial categories all the time. Like, it just, what you're saying, what I'm saying, what other people are saying, it just feels like we're running in the other direction. And to the extent that we are, you know, liberal progressives, maybe with the best intentions, but they are segregating by race. I mean, that's literally just, I don't know how to say it. There's no other way to describe it. I mean, pick your example, right? How do we have these conversations in society about race and trying to have nuanced conversations about this, where, you know, half the stuff that you said will, you know, in certain contexts will get you canceled and fired. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, that's a real thing that happens to people, right? How do we do this, you know, with, you know, cancel culture, if you will, or in a society that is very, very, very much not pursuing a spirit of forgiveness and seeing our humanity and seeing that people make mistakes, past or present, that there's no rehabilitative piece for people. What are your thoughts on how we do that?
It's going to require that people have courage. Right now, we're in a moment where very few people want to go against consensus. There's a rapidly evolving and rather punitive consensus on all fronts, not just in certain hot button issues, but basically a kind of consensus that like insists on determining what's right and wrong in every aspect of our increasingly publicly mediated lives. We live in glass houses and technological houses that are really like panopticons, constantly performing our views for public critique and critiquing the views of others that we encounter. Oftentimes very cavalierly without really giving much thought into context or what somebody's really meaning to say. But, you know, it's a problem. It's going to require people, many more people having the courage to say, you know what? No, no, that's wrong. Like, slow down. I'm not going to actually, I'm not going to silence myself. I'm not going to say something I don't believe or insist you say something you don't believe. If there is something wrong, if there's something I disagree with, then I'm going to counter that with more speech. I'm going to try to make a better point. But we're going to stop trying to undermine people and get them fired from their place of employment or stigmatized and become persona non grata because we disagree with something that they said, that we then use against them. People are going to just have to reject that at scale. It's not so different from the conversation we were having about race. All of this could stop tomorrow if enough people said this needs to stop.
Mm-hmm. So 2 points to that. If I take the most charitable view of some folks on that are on this side of things, right, that are canceling people or getting people fired, the most charitable view in my opinion is that, look, racism, according to folks on this side, is a systemic problem. We've been dealing with this for hundreds of years. The country has so many dark chapters. We have to stop. We got to put an end to all of this stuff, right? It's not okay to say racial slurs. I don't care if you were 17 years old. It's not okay that, you're making jokes. It's not okay. We have to not allow that. And the best way to do it is, we got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. I mean, that's just what's going to happen. It sucks, but that's the most charitable view, right? If I talk to my very progressive friends, that's what they'll say. Well, maybe just don't be a racist is what they'll, or maybe just don't be an asshole, right? And how do we, I'm with you, I hear you, but how do you incentivize people being courageous? Because then on the other side, right, you have folks on the right or other folks that will do this kind of, they'll do the victimization thing too, right? I was a victim of cancel culture. It's behind every bush and every tree in society and online. And I'm not saying that it isn't a real thing. Obviously it is, but there are people that I think probably take it very, very extreme. How do we have courage? Because even when you have, again, you can take any example you want, but even after people will say, make an apology, right? If they've done something wrong or they speak out against something and, they speak extemporaneously, they chirp themselves up and they apologize after. And, it doesn't go anywhere, right? We're cleaning the society, right? We're cleansing the society of all this racism. I don't see any incentive for people to be courageous. If someone can be fired at the New York Times for something they said on a trip in Peru, if someone, 17-year-old tweets, if someone is, making a very, insensitive comment on a Zoom call for a university, all these examples that have happened in the past month or so, and there's plenty preceding that. No one wants to say, yes, let me put myself out there and be courageous so I could get my ass fired. No one wants to do that. How do we, I don't have answers and I don't know. It's not good. I don't think it's good. But I just don't know. What are your thoughts?
There are people though, who are consistently courageous. There are people who have been outspoken on this from the jump and they model a way of resisting. Some of them have been penalized. Some of them have found ways to turn that into, a way of making a living and having a brand as being courageous. There's new platforms through which you can make quite a lot of money by rejecting consensus, actually. So it's not so, I don't think it's so straightforward as nobody can take a stand because you'll just get mowed down and be unable to feed your family. I think that many more people, look at Trader Joe's. This is the best example. This is a hopeful example. Cancel culture, what's called cancel culture, operates on the logic that no one will be courageous. And oftentimes it wins that way, that no one will stand up, that everyone will just capitulate. Trader Joe's, there was some call out for their line of salsa, Trader Jose's. It was considered insensitive to Latinos, and it was demanded that they cancel this.
I was deeply offended, Thomas. I mean, I saw that in the store and I was like, God, I can't walk down that aisle. I'm so offended.
Trader Joe's simply said, no, that's not racist. And we're not going to bow to this. We reject that that's racist, and our customers know us and they like it. And no, the thing went away in 3 days. It was over. Mm-hmm. They just refused to countenance it. This could happen, maybe not always, but it could happen many more times. And yeah, to your theoretical progressive friend who says society should be less racist, of course society should be less racist. Very few people would actually argue that. The problem is all about what are we defining as racism, and the goalposts are moving so fast, and the Overton window is flying open. So it's just it's all of the action is in what is actually meant by racism. It used to be very clear. It used to be, what Martin Luther King was talking about was very comprehensible. What we're talking about now, it's rapidly evolving. It's difficult to always even keep up. People are making, people are saying racist comments, and they should have some type of consequence for that. They should also have paths to redemption. But also people are saying things that, 2 days ago, no one knew were racist, and society didn't function as though they were racist. And today, it's beyond the pale. And people are also being punished for things that they did at points in their life when they didn't, understand that they were going to be publicly critiqued. People are having their childhoods dredged up. People are having comments that should, in all fairness in a just society, be subject to the statute of limitations, brought up as though they were said right now. And, even historical figures are being scrutinized in a way that cannot possibly be healthy. So this is where all of the, I think, disagreement is. It's not that people are advocating for society to remain racist. Very few people really want that.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's also, for me, when we get really exercised about Salsa Jose or Aunt Jemima or Dr. Seuss or whatever these things are, to me it's just it's kind of like this very short-term fix, and there's still the long-term issues where we have to change certain policies, or you have to the compromise, and how you're able to really, roll up your sleeves and, get dirty with how you have to make compromise with legislation. Like, those are the things that are really, I think, important, right? I don't think anyone gives two shits about Aunt Jemima or Dr. Seuss. I don't know who was calling
for that. They do. Some people do, but they shouldn't.
Some people do.
About what will make Chicago a safer city where people can get an education and people can have access to quality housing. What will make students who are not reading at level be able to read at level. Yeah. These are things why can't poor kids of any background get into Harvard, and why is diversity so much about rewarding elites from ethnic minorities? These are questions that would actually do something if they were answered to improve our society. The rest of what you're talking about is a kind of theater. Like taking your shoes off in the airport. It doesn't actually make you safer, but it seems to be where a lot of the energy is, and it's a shame because, the family, from what I understand, that got a royalty from the Aunt Jemima name, didn't want that to go away, Oftentimes it has nothing to do with real people.
Right. And it becomes, it's this moral panic that we're just pushing on overdrive at this point, where at some point people, I would hope that, that they're just like, look, enough's enough. Like we get some of this, and maybe some of it has good intentions, but a lot of it does seem like a lot of, we're just going to make you our poster child for this week. And in that example, it was like, we weren't asking for this. We weren't harmed by this.
It was something that we were proud of because it was our ancestor who had, who had received some form of recognition for this recipe that she had. I mean, it seems to me that we just, it's all the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And it's, it's a moral panic. Absolutely. People are on the lookout for evidence of wrongthink. And oftentimes the zeal is all in correcting things that don't actually matter in the scheme of things. And meanwhile, there's extraordinary racialized inequality that has a lot to do with class and has a lot to do with, histories of oppression that is getting addressed in no way. And this is all in some ways a kind of semantic and rhetorical game for elites. It's a way of non-white elites figuring out, ways of negotiating more slices of the pie for themselves. But, if you're talking about equality, what is actually going to get people living on equal terms with each other? A lot of this isn't going to do it.
Yeah. And I think in that way, if I think for me, you were talking about the courageous piece about, kind of the cancel culture stuff, but I also think if we have enough people of all different kinds of racial categories, Black, white, Latin, Asian, Native, etc., where they're I don't want to say propped up, but if there's more of a spotlight on the actual activities they're trying to do and change within policy and legislation in their communities, and we have more things to talk about there and give more energy to that, it kind of gives this kind of counterweight of sorts, where it's like, okay, there might be some people that wanted, go ahead and cancel this movie, or, this person said something, but there's this whole other group of people over here that are doing all of this work about changing all these other things. I don't know if you know her, there's this really brilliant writer, Brittany King. She's a Black woman, and I had a conversation with her about half a year ago now, and she had something that stuck with me. She said that, during the Civil War, what made sense was the Underground Railroad, right? That made sense at that time, right? For obviously Black folks were literally fearing for their lives. That was an efficient way of trying to get through, and you had other courageous figures. She said, in the civil rights, during Jim Crow and then civil rights after that, sit-ins and protests and marches and all that was very helpful, right? Because you could be seen in public and you could have many things, but you couldn't get a seat at the table per se, right? And that was a helpful tool to try and get that. And so her hypothesis was that, maybe in the second decade of the 21st century, we don't need to have all these marches. We don't need to have all of these, sit-ins. Like, it worked for that time in the 50s and 60s. And now that we're 70 years later, just as then you wouldn't have an Underground Railroad, that wouldn't make sense. Maybe now we don't need to do that as much. Now, that's not to say that, marches and rallies and protests aren't, are bad things, but maybe more of it now is we've had, our vice president is a Black woman, we had a Black president. There's plenty of Black Americans that are, CEOs of big companies. We do have a seat at the table in some ways, or Black folks have a seat at the table in some ways. Maybe there's alternative ways in this time frame of getting kinds of marshaling up some type of movements to make change. And maybe there is more of a space to make change at a legislative and more in the day-to-day types of things. And a lot of this other stuff seems like, dissonance or some kind of noise. And so I don't know what you think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that we probably, in terms of showing public outrage at certain violations that do happen in terms of law enforcement, perhaps, mass protests are what is needed, but there must be other ways of continuing to perfect a society that are more aware of the enormous gains that non-whites have made in the society since the civil rights era. That's absolutely sensible to me. I'm going to look up her stuff. I like that.
Yeah, she's great. She wrote a great piece. I can send it to you on why we need to have diversity of thought within the Black community. And she looks at 4 different figures throughout time. It's a great piece. That's why
I already like her. I could tell.
Great. Yeah, she's great. She's great. Well, I don't want to keep you. I know you're a busy man. So any last words and anything you want to say, and then where's the best place for people to find you and find your work?
Great, man. Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking with an intelligent person. People can find me on Twitter at Thomas Chatwill. But that's going to be, I think, a less interesting place maybe than finding, my writing, which is in the New York Times Magazine, at Harper's, and in other publications, and the books. I think the best place to find me is in Losing My Cool, or Self-Portrait in Black and White. Yeah, that's where to find me.
Yeah. Thomas, I've been reading your stuff, and I've mentioned you in other conversations I've had. So it's really a big privilege and honor to talk to you. I had a lot of fun doing it, and you have so many wise things to share, and so I will keep putting your stuff out there, defending you where it's needed, and
appreciate it.
Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, brother.
All right, man.